Okay, I'd like to welcome you to this Shadow Open Market Committee meeting based on our dinner last night with the Shadow Open Market Committee members, Pat Harker, who's president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and Mike Dotsey, who's his director of research. It was a very informative and lively meeting last night, and I expect more of the same today with interesting papers. Would just like to note in your program, Debbie, we misspelled your name.
I saw that.
We apologize.
Thank you.
Okay. Secondly, we'd like to roundly welcome Andy Levin as the newest member to the Shadow Open Market Committee, a renowned economist who spent the vast majority of his career at the Federal Reserve, and now he's crossed the line, and he's actually doesn't drink the Kool-Aid anymore, but is still rational about it. And so with that, we should start the first panel. Greg?
Thank you, Mickey. The title of this morning's panel is Characteristics of the Fed's Independence and Accountability. Our topic reminds me of one of the most intriguing and surprising papers that I recall in my time as a member of the Shadow Open Market Committee, which, as I did the math, was 20 years and made me feel just a little bit older than I sometimes feel. In 2009, Anna Schwartz, an exceptional scholar of monetary and fiscal institutions and their histories, as well as an original member of the Shadow Open Market Committee, wrote a paper entitled Boundaries Between the Fed and the Treasury. In this article, she pointed to an area of disagreement, I underscore the word disagreement, between herself and her longtime co-author, Milton Friedman. She writes on page 4 of her presentation, "It may be of some surprise that Milton Friedman, a believer in limited government, proposed subordinating the Fed to the Treasury Department, not as an ideal, but as an improvement of existing arrangements. He contended that it would result in a single locus of power on monetary and fiscal policies and would establish accountability for mistakes in policy that otherwise would leave each institution free to blame the other for policy errors." Quite prescient. Dr. Schwartz concludes by writing, "I do not agree with Friedman's definition of the optimal relationship between the Treasury and the Fed." And at this point, she's talking more specifically about the issuance of debt and Fed behavior during as it issues debt. She goes on to say, "I believe the Treasury's policy during peacetime are not necessarily preferable to monetary policies that give priority to maintaining the purchasing power of the currency over the long run. The Fed is more immune to political pressure than the Treasury is. Political control in the hands of uninformed legislators is hardly the summum bonum, i.e. the highest good, of a monetary system that provides financial stability and public trust of financial activity." Dr. Schwartz's sharp insights continue to identify key concepts for today's conference and today's markets. Importantly, in the period just before the 2008 financial crisis, many monetary policy and central bank experts placed minimal importance on the democratic political framework in which the Federal Reserve resides. Subsequently, these experts have had to relearn that for the Fed to maintain its political independence and thereby deliver its dual mandate, it will have to accept constraints, even self-constraints in its actions and decision-making, so that it remains politically accountable in a democratic system that is based on a system of checks and balances. These constraints can include appropriate rule-based framework, which we'll talk about later today, and limits on the size and composition of its asset purchases and sales, as well as its lender of last resort function. Indeed, this lesson is even more critical now during periods of low interest rates or in earlier periods of financial crises, where the Fed can too easily, unintentionally, or intentionally engage in fiscal and credit actions as part of its monetary policy and central bank decisions. Fortunately, the members of the Shadow Open Market Committee have remained dedicated to the principles in the SOMC and core beliefs, which we published in 2014. Consequently, it is my opinion that our approach and our beliefs best allows the Fed to maintain its political independence, whereby it embeds constraints on its actions that will enhance its political accountability and thereby maximize our ability to achieve its dual mandates. Now the introduction is given. Charlie Calmeres, I believe, will go first, and then we'll have a question or two, and then Debbie will speak. It turns out that there's disagreement, and this should be some fun today. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg, and good morning, everyone. There's a long paper in your packet, but I will ask you to find this short handout so you can follow along with me. So one of the advantages of writing a long paper is I don't have to read it to you, because you can read it. And I just will be pretty brief in my summary of it. So the first thing I want to do is define the topic. What do I mean when I talk about independence, and what do I think is a useful way to talk about it? So I've given my definition in one sentence. The independence of authority of any agency is usefully defined as its ability to act within the confines of a legislative mandate on the basis of judgment and with the expectation of impunity. In other words, we live in a democracy. Independence of the Fed doesn't mean the Fed gets to do whatever it wants. That's what dictators do. That's not what agents within a democracy do. So there has to be a legislative mandate that defines what appropriate action is. By the way, even the infallibility of the Pope, if you're not a theologian, you may not know this, is not without limit. The Pope is only infallible if he's acting within the confines of accepted church doctrine. And the similar is true for the Council of Bishops in the Orthodox Church. In other words, independence is defined within a context which is provided by democratic legislation. So what I want to do is then say, okay, well, now we have an idea that you can act based on your judgment about satisfying that mandate with accountability, I should also point out, but with impunity. That is, as long as you're exercising your judgment in good faith, you can do that. And what I do is, in the paper, I use the history of the Fed and theory of political economy to trace variation over time in the degree of Fed independence following this definition. And I do so both with respect to monetary policy and regulatory policy. And one of the key points I'm making is the two are closely related. Not positively correlated, but maybe negatively correlated, because often the Fed uses giving up independence on its regulatory policy to try to preserve independence in monetary policy. That's been a key theme of the last 80 years or so. Now, there are four necessary conditions you can see here on the first page for independence, I argue. One is that you have a clear statutory mandate, because you can't have legitimate exercise of authority without that. Then you have to have power being granted to you by the legislation. And then there has to be an expected persistence of that authority. But the final and most important thing is that you have to have leadership that's committed to promoting independence of action. That is, and the overarching point of the history of Fed independence, and this is the one I want to really emphasize, is that it's not variation in the statutory rules governing the Fed that explains most of the variation in the effective independence of the Fed. Rather, it's decisions of Fed officials that has been the best explanation of the variation in the degree of independence of the Fed. And that is, I think, an important theme, and I'll come back to explain what I mean by that more. So if you turn to the next page, what I do is I try to talk about two strategies, because there's a huge disconnect. Going back to Milton Friedman's 1962 work on what effective independence of monetary authorities might mean, and the 2009 article that Greg just read, and work by Alan Meltzer, and you're going to hear from Charles Plosser and also Marvin Goodfriend, citing a lot of these people. There's one vision that I would call the academic, maybe you might call it the Shadow Open Market Committee academic vision of what would be a strategy for the Fed that would produce independence, what actions by their leadership would produce it. But what's also interesting is there's a clear strategy coming from Fed history of the leaders, and the two couldn't be more different. And so what I do on this page is I basically talk about 4 dimensions in which they are diametrically opposed. So what's interesting is, I think if you asked people who are Fed leaders, how do we promote our independence? They would give you a list of 4 things, if they were honest, that they do, the history shows that they do, that are actually diametrically opposed to the list of the 4 things that that alternative strategy would say. So let's just go through that and think about that for a minute. Why are there these 2 diametrically opposed strategies? So the Fed leader strategy revealed as a revealed preference of the way they've behaved is first, well, independence means that we're not constrained by a legislative mandate too much. So they always support a fuzzy mandate. They think independence means very different from what I think. They think it means that the democracy doesn't try to tell them too closely what they should do. So we have a fuzzy mandate, a dual, or you might even say now 4 different mandates that the Fed has with no weights or priorities among them. The Fed likes it that way. They're not suggesting any need for reform. Secondly, they seek as much regulatory power as possible. And this has been very visible. And one of the things I don't think is well known is, when did the Federal Reserve Board first get regulatory power? It's a good question to ask yourself. And what was the circumstance in which they got it? The answer is, in the 1930s, when their stock was as low as it could possibly be. So just try to remember what happened in 1933 to 35. New authorities were created, the FDIC and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And they, not the Fed, were given authority over the banking system to decide which banks would reopen and when, which banks would receive assistance. The Fed's failure in its discount window lending policy actually was recognized and was the reason why the Reconstruction Finance Corporation innovated in 1933 to start issuing preferred stock. So the point is, the Fed actually was not a regulator that anybody particularly liked. How did the Fed get power initially? And the answer is, the Fed was the only entity that was tracking what were called chain and group bank conglomerates. And part of the 1933 change in policy was a decision to try to prevent mergers or effective consolidations through chain and group banking. And since the Fed was the only entity that possessed that information, the Fed was given that authority. That became the Bank Holding Company Act authority of the Fed later, and it also became the lever through which the Fed built all of its authority leading up to Gramm-Leach-Bliley and beyond Gramm-Leach-Bliley to Dodd-Frank. And the Fed has consistently pushed to expand that regulatory authority. And my interpretation of that history is that the Fed sees power as a vehicle to protect regulatory power as a vehicle to protect monetary policy independence. Third part of the strategy, use non-traditional fiscal tools whenever that's a convenient way to achieve your objectives without much concern about long-term consequences. So probably the best example of this is, well, we're worried about the mortgage market, we want to goose the economy, so we're going to get into purchasing and holding mortgage-backed securities, which is effectively a fiscal policy to subsidize a particular interest rate spread. Of course, once you do that, then everyone realizes, well, now we can use the Fed's balance sheet for lots of other fiscal things, highways. Actually, this has happened, right? So the Fed, you might think, would have said, well, once we step into a fiscal realm, we invite the government to see us as an off-budget fiscal resource fund, so we shouldn't have done that. That's going to invite challenges to our effective independence. But the Fed doesn't think that way, apparently. And then the final thing is, manage your political risks by entering into alliances with powerful players. And the identities of those players change depending on political tides. Unit bankers were a part of that. It switched to large bankers. I won't talk right now, but I'll come back to it in the Q&A to talk about probably the most embarrassing episode of the Fed, which was their oversight of the bank merger process from 1992 to 2007, in which they were charged with the authority to hold hearings to decide which banks could merge, and they used that opportunity to allow banks that wanted to merge to bring witnesses to testify on their behalf that they were good citizens. Those witnesses were paid, explicitly paid, $2.5 trillion contractually to testify at those hearings. It's kind of unbelievable. We can talk more about that. So the Fed, of course, knew that. These are public documents. You can read about all this in my book, Fragile by Design, with Steve Haber. But the point is, it was all reported in the newspaper. And it was considered a virtuous thing because they were making sure that the mergers were happening for good citizen banks. But of course, many people thought that was a very strange thing. You might even call it extortion, that the Fed was overseeing. And the reason for it was politically very expedient for the Fed. So that was probably maybe the darkest moment for the Fed's decision to enter into alliances for the purposes of preserving its monetary independence. So, all right, so that's one strategy. That's what the Fed's been doing. What's another strategy? Support a clear mandate with a primary focus on price stability, which people like Paul Volcker particularly has mentioned, and with adherence to a clear rule that insulates the Fed from political attacks. So I think Milton Friedman may have been the first person in 1962 to emphasize this, that if the Fed has a clear rule, then when somebody comes and tries to muscle them, either in a hearing before Congress or in a back room with the president, there's not really much room to muscle because the Fed just says, well, you want me, you're trying to pressure me, but here's my rule, it's transparent, that's what I follow. I don't have to explain my discretionary decisions because it's all there. And there's no room for pressuring me because there's the rule. That was, of course, a fundamental insight that Friedman had. And it's clearly a great way to preserve independence. Furthermore, avoid fiscal actions. Marvin Goodfriend's pointed this out for decades, actually, because they will do what we've seen they've done, which is invite further sort of attempts to use the Fed as a fiscal off-budget tool. Third, avoid non-monetary powers, regulatory powers, because they're a lightning rod for politics, as we saw in those merger hearings that I described, but in many other things that I won't go into right now. And what's interesting is right before the crisis, the U.S. Treasury issued a white paper suggesting exactly that in detail. Preserving some of the Fed's supervisory authority that's necessary for administering the discount window, but getting rid of these kinds of lightning rods of politics so that they would preserve monetary independence, among other things. So what's really interesting is look at those two strategies on the page and notice that each of the bullet points of the four is diametrically opposed in the other list. And yet they're both justified on the basis of the notion that somehow that's independence. And so I want to associate myself very much with the second list. So is independence valuable? In theory, yes, because the main two things it avoids are myopia, making short-term decisions that aren't in the long-run interest, and log rolling, making decisions that by themselves aren't advantageous, but are part of some complex, convoluted political bargain. But in practice, and this is where I think economists kind of missed the boat a little bit. In theory, independence is valuable, but what Alan Meltzer taught us in his 3-volume history of the Fed is that in practice, independence often was not used very well. The Riefler-Burgess doctrine and the Great Depression, the Phillips curve and the Great Inflation, the DSGE model and the financial crisis. All of those are actually thinking mistakes, not the result of a lack of independence of thinking, but actually, in some sense, the fact that there was independence of thinking. And here, this is one of the most brilliant insights I think Alan Meltzer had, which is, for independence to be useful, you need systematic monetary policy for two reasons. One is to promote independence, but the other one is that if the policy is systematic, then it's actually out there for everyone to discuss. And the best antidote to bad thinking is sunshine. But you can't have sunshine if you don't say what the policy is. Then you can't have a discussion and you can't find the errors. So we shouldn't make independence a god. Independence is not a god. It's a good thing, But it only works if the thinking's good that goes along with independence, since we need systematic monetary policy both to promote independence and to promote better thinking. Because without the good thinking, I'm not sure why we care about independence. So the things I would say in closing, two things. First, obviously the things we need to do are create a primary and clear price stability mandate with a flexible inflation targeting systematic policy, and remove regulatory power. Go back and read that Treasury white paper from 2008 and bring it back in. And I would say, finally, appoint people with courage and who share this vision of this second strategy for Fed independence, which unfortunately we've not done. Instead, we've appointed mainly pusillanimous get-along, go-alongs, which of course is what works well in Washington. Final page, what about presidential threats to independence? So this was systematic in the 1930s and 1940s, of course. Johnson and Nixon later are great examples of pressure behind closed doors. And here's what I would say about that. As long as the president has appointment authority, which is part of the Fed's political balance, there's going to be this presidential interference. It's part of our democracy. You can bemoan it. You can make it less important by creating systematic policy and doing all the things on that list, but you can't get rid of it, and I'm not even sure I want to. Now, where does Trump's statements fit into that? I would say that Trump's statements should be viewed as a political insurance policy that he's trying to take out during the election so that he can blame the Fed if things go south. Everyone knows that. His statements have received no support from his own political party or even from economists in his administration. And I would say that I don't really see them as any real threat to Fed independence. Think about it this way. Ask yourself this question. Is Jay Powell toast at this point in terms of Trump's only real power, which is reappointment? Yes. And so he's even more independent, right? Because over the remainder of his term, he doesn't care what Trump thinks about him. So what's the logic exactly that leads people to be so bemoaning the worries about how Trump's statement are threats to Fed independence? I think it's a joke. The big threat to Fed independence is what the Fed leaders themselves think the strategy is for promoting independence. Thank you.
Good adrenaline rush to start the morning, Charlie. We said we'd take a couple questions. Anybody, I saw an eyebrow raised over here about the $2 trillion question. Anybody like to ask a question or two before we go on to Debbie, please?
Was that 2 trillion or 2 billion?
Wait for the microphone, please.
2.4 trillion. Now, 90% of that took the form of contractual commitments to pass through loans based on, from the banks who entered the contract, based on the identification by the activist groups of which borrowers were members of their organization and deserved to receive the loan. 10% of it's outright grants to the organizations.
So this is commitments of loans, not gifts.
90% was commitments to make favored loans through that were identified, the parties receiving them, identified by the activist groups that were signatories to the agreement. The other 10% of the money is just outright grants to those groups from the banks.
So it was not, the whole 2 trillion was not consultant salaries.
No, I'm saying clearly, of the 2.4 trillion, by the way, there's some disagreement about the number. I'm using the low number. Peter Wallison believes the number is more than 4 trillion, but I can only say for sure that I know about 2.4.
Thank you. Please, yes.
Yes, I'm Michael Myers of New York Civil Rights Coalition. Let me ask Charlie a question about presidential prerogative and power. Does the president meet with any of the federal commissioners, and can he call them up and start lobbying against the chairman? I mean, or is this just a publicity thing to say, well, I told them, but they're not going to listen to me? What kind of meetings or calls are made to other commissioners who are appointees of the president to pressure the chair to do what the president wants?
Okay, so there may be somebody who knows better than I. I am not aware of any legal limitations on who the president can talk to. The president sometimes meets with the chairman. I'm not aware of the president ever having met with other members of the board, but he probably has. But I don't think there's any particular legal restrictions on that. The legal restrictions I'm aware of have to do with the board members at the Federal Reserve Board meeting more than two at the same time outside of the regular meeting. But I don't think there are any limits on what the president can do.
Okay. All right, we'll take one more. We'll go in the back there, and then we'll go in the back one more, and then we'll allow Debbie to talk, and then we'll open it up even more.
Thank you. Why are you so hot and bothered about the Fed venturing into fiscal policy? Even if the Fed's only instrument were raising interest rates, that has implications for the construction sector, which is the same thing as buying or selling mortgage-backed securities. Remember when Paul Volcker was raising interest rates, construction participants were sending him 2x4s.
Well, it's not because it's not an effective tool. It's because it's not an appropriate tool in our democracy. The Fed has a particularly limited mandate. By the way, I have an article written about the creation of the charters of about 50 countries' central banks. One of the things about the creation of the U.S. charter, and it's true also as a result of Dodd-Frank, is in our democracy, we have been extremely stingy in the powers that we've given our central bank. So that's part of the way our democracy works. We at least in theory, don't seem to agree that we want our democracy for the central bank to be a fiscal authority. And now in a lot of other places, there are more complicated arrangements of checks and balances between the central bank and the Treasury. For example, in Canada, it's a more complicated three-step process. In some countries, actually, the central bank has explicit authority to give credit guarantees, but not in our country. And so the point is that we have decided that the Fed doesn't have that authority. And let me remind you that in Dodd-Frank, we actually rolled back, partly with that justification, the Fed's ability to make certain kinds of loans, unsecured loans. So it's really a question about our democracy, not a question about what tools work, what things and how much we want to let a central bank do. And I would emphasize there's a lot of variation across the charters of the 50 countries that I studied.
All right. I know we have a few questions now, but we'll hold off, and I'd like to introduce Debbie Lucas for the next talk.
Thanks, Greg. As you'll hear, Charlie and I violently agree and violently disagree, so surely there will be blood. And I also want to note that he distributed a nice long paper. I distributed 2 papers, so whereas he said what he wrote very succinctly, I'm going to say more than I wrote. I didn't quite get to the point of finishing writing things down clearly, but I hope that when I do, if you find what I say interesting, you might take a look and give me feedback. So I actually labeled this Some Heretical Ideas on Central Bank Independence, and that's because I think in some ways they do go against the mainstream of my fellow SOMC members. In any case, I want to think about the broad questions of what economic, legal, and political underpinnings are for independent central banks in democratic societies, and what objectives, responsibilities, and practices will allow them to best serve society while maintaining popular support for independence. Obviously, the long-running debate for these questions has been reinvigorated by the extraordinary actions and expansion of central bank power on both sides of the Atlantic in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. So I agreed to write this note on these issues as a personal commitment device to begin to explore some fundamental issues that seem critical to me and to the independence question, but I think they tend to be glossed over often or dismissed out of hand. At Michael Bordeaux's suggestion, I carefully read Paul Tucker's recent book, Unelected Power, and that was an excellent suggestion. You can understand some of my comments as almost a critical review of some of those ideas and also a response to the precepts of my fellow members of the SOMC. Okay, so my concerns with the omissions in conventional narratives rests on 4 propositions. The first is that the case for independent central banks applies equally well to a number of other critical government functions. The second is that the distinction between monetary and fiscal policy is fuzzy, more semantic than functional. In principle, the economic effects of most monetary policies could be replicated through a well-chosen system of taxes and transfers. Third, central bank policies, conventional, unconventional, or regulatory, have first-order distributional consequences. And then finally, the state of knowledge about the effects of central bank policies on the macroeconomy and financial markets supports only very limited delegation to experts, so-called, on these matters. So taken together, these propositions present a challenge to what might be described as the doctrine of monetary exceptionalism, the belief that the advantage of insulating monetary policy from the political realm are unquestionably so large that it is worth skirting the normal channels of democratic oversight in favor of delegating to technocrats. Sorry, I'm failing to use my computer. Here we go. Okay. Because I believe the above propositions are true, for reasons I'm going to only elaborate on briefly in the interest of time, I'm doubtful that proponents of exceptionalism will be able to shield central banks from a rapid loss of independence when inevitable future missteps shake the current political consensus that a high level of autonomy is warranted. Now, none of this is to deny that there are strong merits in constrained independence as conventionally enumerated, particularly for price level stability. Rather, it's to suggest that if transparency by independent central bankers is a prerequisite for legitimacy in a democratic society, they need to do more. If they want to maintain independence, they need to proactively address the fiscal and distributional consequences of their actions to a much greater extent than they do currently. That includes developing standards for measuring and communicating those consequences to the public. Further, I believe that when central bank policy have significant distributional and fiscal side effects, that it is appropriate for the political process to reinsert itself. That might entail instituting other policies to offset the side effects or constraining the policy choices of central bankers. Of course, central bankers will naturally fight such interventions and strive to preserve operating flexibility. They might also voluntarily adopt policies perceived to be more consistent with the public's sense of distributional fairness, as I think has been the case with the CRA Act. So while unlikely to produce first best outcomes, on the whole, this seems a healthy dynamic and one that perhaps in the long run will sustain the legitimacy of independent central banks. Now, if I have a little bit more time, I want to continue and elaborate on some of these ideas. So first of all, what makes an agency independent? There's no single criteria that really defines this. It generally refers in the US to agencies that are part of the executive branch under the Constitution, but that to some extent are insulated from presidential control. Functionally, and this is a suggestion by Paul Tucker, independence requires three things: some job security for the director. It entails some control over its policy instruments or rulemaking authorities. And lastly, some agencies that are independent are fortunate enough to have budgetary autonomy, which insulates them from interference by both the executive and the legislative branches. Interestingly, agencies that have been classified as independent in the US have long been exempt from the requirement of other executive branch agencies to back their rulemakings with cost-benefit analysis. That protection of independent agencies has crumbled, and I think that's a good thing. If anything, independent agencies should have stiffer requirements to justify their actions to the public than ones that are more directly accountable to the electoral process. As background for all of this, I also asked myself, maybe you know the answer, how prevalent are independent agencies in the U.S.? I was somewhat surprised to learn that there's at least 29 of them. So there's a lot of independent agencies to go around. The Federal Reserve stands out for having all three of the hallmarks of functional independence: job security, policy control, and budgetary autonomy. It is distinguished from its independent peers primarily on the appropriations front. The other agencies are mostly subject to budgetary appropriations from Congress, whereas the Fed is, of course, allowed to pay for its expenses from the substantial cash flows it earns from its operations. Now, Federal Reserve officials are quick to point out that they take great care not to abuse that privilege of keeping money and thereby putting their independence at risk. But nevertheless, if the tide turns against independence, it seems that financial autonomy will be a natural target for greater political control. So what I want to turn to is my contention that the case for independent central banking isn't all that exceptional. My practical policy background is actually in federal budgeting, not central banking. And as any budgeteer will tell you, you quickly become accustomed to hearing advocates for every conceivable good cause. Each makes a sincere case that the societal benefits of their particular program or agency, were to be properly measured, clearly outweighs the costs and perhaps deserves a carve-out from the normal budget rules because of it. So as you can hear, I have a predisposition to be skeptical that central bankers are just another special interest with an inflated view of the relative importance of their domain. On the other hand, there are truly compelling elements of the case for independence. The idea that monetary policy requires credibility to be effective, that politicians have a particularly strong incentive to put their fingers in the monetary cookie jar, thereby causing inflation and commandeering resources for their own purposes, and that price and financial stability broadly benefits society. These are all strong arguments for some degree of central bank independence, but I think equally strong arguments can be made in other policy realms. Just to give some examples, I've written in the past on why these arguments apply equally well to independence of independent budget agencies. And in line with that reasoning, independent budget offices are in fact being instituted throughout the EU and in many other parts of the world. Another example is the environment. The increasingly broad agreement that climate change represents an existential challenge and the multidisciplinary technical knowledge required to evaluate potential solutions suggests that it too is a strong candidate for delegation to an independent agency. I recognize that, like the advocates for particular budget priorities I encountered at CBO, these particular choices for where independence is justified come through my personal lens and experiences. But nevertheless, these examples serve to make my general point that it's fairly easy to come up with strong arguments for why various policies should be delegated to independent agencies, and that the justifications for independent central banks are certainly persuasive, but not exceptionally strong. Okay. So the line of reasoning that I just went through is perhaps what led Alan Blinder, as quoted by Paul Tucker, to wonder aloud why vast areas of government policy are not in fact designated to independent agencies, not just to central banks. Paul Tucker has a thoughtful response to this that I agree with. He notes that, quote, powers should be delegated only if society has broadly settled preferences, and those preferences can be specified in an objective that is clear and monitorable. Otherwise, there is nothing to commit to, and so to monitor the technocratic ends. Excuse me. He, by the way, asserts that financial stability satisfies his criteria, but the climate doesn't, and I don't agree with that. But anyway, he goes on to say, decisions should be made by experts in the relevant field, While that seems obvious, it means that delegation to insulated officials should occur only where society recognizes that there is a body of professional technical knowledge, imperfect though it inevitably will prove, relevant to the delivering the regime's purposes. That would rule out some fields, and he goes on. So I strongly agree with that sentiment and believe that consideration has the clear implication that the domain of activities falling to central bankers needs to be heavily constrained, in effect reversing the trend of the last decades towards putting more and more responsibility on them. Far greater modesty, I believe, is required about what monetary policy can be expected to accomplish if central banks are to maintain their independence. Okay, I know I have only 2 minutes, and I'm going to hurry. Let me just say a word or two about fiscal and distributionary policy. So I will assert there's no bright line between monetary and fiscal policy because all monetary policy can be effectively replicated by a system of taxes and transfers. Rather, the functional division between the monetary and the fiscal is a matter of what's assigned to monetary authorities. If it's assigned in some sense, it becomes viewed as monetary. I believe that there are fiscal impacts of all monetary policies, and this contrasts with the views of someone like Marvin Goodfriend, who feels that if the Fed makes open market purchases and they buy government bonds, that's not fiscal, whereas if they buy private bonds, it is fiscal. The reason I disagree is that any policy that moves interest rates is effectively a tax on savers and a transfer to borrowers. There's also disagreement about whether massively supplying liquidity to financial markets is fiscal. I believe that's also fiscal. First of all, there's no clear line between a liquidity crisis and a solvency crisis. Providing safety is valuable. It transfers risk. Government-induced risk and value transfers are essentially fiscal. I think there's much more agreement that paying above market rates on reserves falls squarely into the fiscal realm, and I hope to talk more about that in the future. So in any case, if central banks were to follow my recommendation of more explicitly quantifying and communicating about fiscal and distributional impacts, a lot of these issues would come to the fore and would get more discussion, which I think would be a good thing. Finally, on distributional effects, as others have noted, a lot of the distributional effects are unintentional, but nevertheless they're large. A few basis point changes on the vast number of credit instruments out there have huge effects on relative wealth of different people. This is true if governments buy private or government bonds. It's true if they follow rules or use discretionary policies. Also, regulatory policies designed to enhance financial stability have distributional effects. For instance, tighter rules that stop banks from taking risk disproportionately affect lower income borrowers who are intrinsically riskier. Because of that, I think, as I started out by saying earlier, that it's understandable that the political authority would take actions in an attempt to offset those effects, for instance, by policies such as the Community Reinvestment Act. So although that might not be an ideal policy, it does address a very real fact that there are these large, sometimes regressive redistributions associated with monetary policy, and I think Federal Reserve independence would be preserved by better recognizing those effects and dealing with them head on. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I think we'll be looking for some fun here. Now, there was a question over here from earlier. Is there something you'd like to follow up with, sir? And then, if not, we'll add to that. It could be about Debbie's paper. It could be about Charlie's. You may want to be responding to Charlie. Then I'll just take some questions about Debbie's. Please.
Is this on? When talking about an independent mandate, and I enjoyed the presentation, one thing that you didn't touch upon, and maybe it was deliberate or maybe you think it's irrelevant, is the concept of once you have a mandate, you should have expected performance, and expected performance requires performance standards and performance measurement. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment upon what performance standards the Fed ought to have for itself that clearly says how well it's basically doing against its own mandate.
Was that for me or for Charlie or both?
No, it's for you.
It's for you. Well, yeah,
I
either
want
one,
to wait,
yeah.
let you have your chance.
Well, no, he was, he actually was a holdover from you, Charlie, so why don't you grab this first if you want? and
I'm
then-
sorry, I was
and Deb will
making
tell you.
notes, but
Okay.
could you restate that? I'm
So
sorry, one more time.
I think his question was about performance standards of the Fed. They do have a mandate. What are the mechanisms in place at the Fed level to bring the Fed to actually accomplish this mandate? Is that fair?
Yeah, I can kind of answer. I expect that Charlie would answer that following a rules-based policy is a natural kind of way of evaluating whether the Fed is or isn't meeting their goals, and that's perhaps one of the arguments in favor.
Yeah.
So I'll answer for him. Now, my
Well,
own
no, that-
answer is that also that.
So you just answered for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was for you, but you can add to
thanks.
the answer. I mean, I feel like it's a hard thing to accomplish, so I didn't talk about it because I was basically kicking it to the political system. I was saying if the Fed wants to be independent, they have to act in a way which is sufficiently perceived as okay that they're allowed to, and I didn't get in, I'm not sure what the detail, I have less clear views on how they can accomplish that, other than to be modest about their general goals so that they are something they can accomplish.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with your characterization of what I would have said, but I want to be more explicit. So one of the things that we saw that was particularly, I think, clear about the lack of performance standards at the Fed was in recent years, you notice that at almost every FOMC meeting, the goalposts were moved. Right? So, we care about this measure of the labor market. Oh, that measure improved. We don't care about that measure anymore. We care about this other measure. Oh, that one improved. We don't care about those two measures anymore. We care about this third measure. So how do I even know what I'm gauging the actions based on? And not to mention the fact that when you have 4 different mandates, there are no weights or priorities among them. The Fed can always justify whatever it does by pointing to one of the 4. And so I think that there are no performance standards. There's fuzzy mixed mandates, which don't say which variables, it's at the labor market, which variable, don't give you weights and don't give you priorities. So I think this is exactly a formula for no accountability. But yeah.
At some point earlier, there were central banks that had contracts, and that the head of the central bank had to deliver their resignation should they not hit certain benchmarks. I don't know how that's evolved across different. And New Zealand was one, and I'm not sure how that's evolved or if it's actually brought about better performance. But it does go to that accountability piece. But it also encroaches on what Debbie identified from Paul Tucker about the employment arrangement aspect, the employment duration aspect. There's a question, please, sir.
Hi, Guy Hazelman. There are more mandates and unclear rules, but it's worse than that. There's also a blurred line now between monetary and fiscal policy. And one of the reasons we got there was the Fed sort of self-proposed themselves, quote, the only game in town, which enables fiscal stalemate, and then they blur the lines. So to kind of reel it back and move us towards clearer rules, aren't you surprised there's just not a lot of more criticism on the Fed for strategy drift and staying in the circles of what the creation of the Fed was supposed to do, so they stop acting like a finance ministry?
I don't know if that was really a question. I guess yes. If I can use that as an opportunity to remark on I really liked Debbie's presentation very much, so this notion that we somehow disagree a lot I think isn't true. But let me just point out the connections to your question from that perspective. So first of all, Debbie and I very strongly, I think, agree that we don't like it when fiscal policy actions are hidden, right? So we don't want the Fed to be able to do something that the public can't perceive as a fiscal policy action because it's being done implicitly through back doors. But I want to also emphasize that this was actually publicly what Bill Clinton said to justify that whole merger wave monkey business that I talked about. He called it the third way. He even gave a name to it. And in the U.S. at that time, it wasn't really possible for Clinton to achieve a lot of his objectives through legislation. And so he created this concept of the third way, which would use the regulatory process as a hidden fiscal tax and transfer policy done through this political process. So I think that implies that Debbie and I hope, both agree that removing regulatory powers from the Fed and putting it into part of the government would make that explicit. And I would also say we should budget score it too. And then another thing relating to fiscal policy, and here's where we don't agree, relating to Guy's point. So fiscal policy, let's say, as related to bailouts, when the Fed makes subsidized loans during an emergency. What I really like about the Canadian model is that they recognize that when the central bank crosses a certain line where it really is fiscal, that it's not just a secured loan against virtually riskless collateral, that they have to get the permission of the Treasury. So it's kind of related to what you're saying. They require, if it's going to be fiscal, that you get the Treasury buy-in. And then the second point, and then I'll let you take it, is I think you've made a major sleight of hand here, because you said, well, it's a fuzzy distinction between fiscal and monetary because I can replicate a lot of monetary things with fiscal actions. But that's acting like the mechanism doesn't matter. Let me remind you that the reason we came up with the words open market operation, and the reason that matters as a mechanism, is that when the central bank intervenes, it does so by purchasing in the open market blindly, not by purchasing from particular parties. If you buy particular parties' debt, that's inherently discriminatory. So what a lot of the debate historically has been about central banks, and this goes back to the Bank of England in the 18th century, is that the central bank, to be legitimate, has to operate indiscriminately. And fiscal policy can't do that. Monetary policy, though, you can create through fiscal mechanisms things that might replicate monetary policy, but the process is different. And here's the thing, for central bank legitimacy, the process matters. So you can't just use this sleight of hand to say, oh, well, there's no distinction. No, there really is a distinction.
No, there isn't, and we violently do disagree. So what we care about, I believe, in society, at least as economists, is distributional outcomes.
No, we care about process, too.
We care about process because we believe that good process leads to better outcomes.
No, because we want our democracy. We want our democracy to function with certain processes.
It's my turn to speak. So we agree that that process matters, but I would still argue that even the most conventional monetary policy is of its essence fiscal. And I didn't have time to quote it, but Paul Tucker basically says the same thing. It's completely fuzzy, and the functional difference is monetary policy is what central banks get to do. Now, we also agree that we think monetary policy shouldn't cover too much, and there may be reasons to carve out certain aspects of what I'm still going to maintain as fiscal policy and let it be run independently. I mean, if you think about the 29 independent agencies, they're doing all manner of pseudo-fiscal policy independently. So I'm not against some carve-out of independence of fiscal policy, but to say that because it's monetary shields it from the kind of examination that other fiscal policy is subject to is what I am objecting to. And I'm saying that the Fed takes these actions that are tantamount to fiscal actions without explaining the extent to which they are tantamount to fiscal actions and the distributional consequences.
We agree.
thereof.
Okay, all right, well, we'll take
So
a
just-
pause here. Everybody takes a breath. Okay, we'll go to the back, and then we've got some people around here, including Andy and Mickey and some others here on the front. Please, in the back, sir.
Good morning. I'm Steve Mallon. I wonder how your thinking would address this. Suppose instead of speaking about independence, you say the Fed is independent within government, which is how I think the Fed defines itself. In that context, how do the rules bend, if at all, if you come to a circumstance where the tools of monetary policy are not successful at achieving the dual mandate?
How do the rules bend?
Okay, well,
You take that one first.
Charlie isn't going to acknowledge that the rules should be able to bend.
No, I don't
And
know what
I'm
it
not an
means.
advocate of rules, so that's where it's kind of hard to say. I mean, I think that a challenge, I don't believe, and I also didn't have time to say, that a rules-based system necessarily protects the popular support for independence all that much, nor that we have enough knowledge to rely completely on rules, which may be what you're alluding to. So if there's an emergency situation
Okay, now I
and the Fed is asked to do something, it's hard for them to do something within the context of those rules. So I will let Charlie
Yeah.
take it from here.
So I think there's an important sort of different strategy about answering your question. And that was related to my point about Canada, but I've also made the point about TARP in the same way. I don't believe that it's right for us, for Congress to pretend, as it did in the reforms of Dodd-Frank, when it withdrew powers from the Fed, that the next time we have a financial crisis, we won't need to do similar things.
Right.
And that, I think, is dishonest. And I have favored, and actually Alan Meltzer in his last published article, maybe with Glenn Hubbard and Doug Holtz-Eakin and I, talked about reinstating those powers in the Fed, if you aren't aware of that. But what's interesting to me, and here's where I agree with Debbie, that I am uncomfortable about giving those powers to the Fed without qualification to deal with an emergency. And I think the right thing to do is to institute, as the Canadians have, a specific policy that says when we have an emergency, what's interesting is the Canadians actually seem to recognize that those things exist. And we might need to do something, which, by the way, they've never had to do, but they still recognize that it might happen. When we have to do something, if we ever do, once you cross a certain line, there has to be explicit buy-in of the government with the central bank to empower it. What's nice about that is it creates the template already there so that if something happens, you can respond, and it creates good due process. So what's really objectionable about the way we're behaving in the United States is that we pretend that we have good due process, and we pretend that these sharp lines exist, and then when the emergency comes, we say, oh, well, we have to bend the rules. You don't have to bend the rules if you create a contingent rule to begin with.
Yeah.
But that's too honest for our Congress.
You know, one of the things that I do admire about the U.S., and this kind of goes to the gray issue. You know, a lot of the gray allowed the Fed to take actions that now have been pulled back a little bit, and I agree with Charlie, will reemerge for the next emergency. There's something about the financial institutional architecture of the U.S. that's kind of unique. Unlike the European, monetary system, which is very kind of horizontal, everybody's kind of got to agree things, there's no verticality to it. You know, the U.S. actually has the ability to remain oftentimes in a very kind of horizontal position. The Fed's compartmentalized vis-a-vis other things, but during periods of crisis, the U.S. becomes a much more vertical system and much more integrated, and the Federal Reserve oftentimes has been able to move quicker and more decisively and with more force. In a way that's actually not terribly democratic at times. The challenge is, and this goes to the other piece, is that the problem is the Fed has extended that authority into a much longer time period than any emergency could ever be imagined. The reason why people aren't squawking about it so much right now is because there's a lot of money flowing into the budget, and if there was a lot of money flowing out of the budget, it would be a topic of conversation. I'm going to go with Mickey, and then I've got Annie's been very patient. We've got some people over here too. Mickey.
I want to applaud Debbie on her third proposition, and that is central bank policies have first-order distributional side effects on both income and wealth that the Fed is absolutely not transparent about. So congratulations on that one. On your second point on this distinction between monetary and fiscal policy is fuzzy. I don't like the term. Charlie, I don't think it's right to say it's sleight of hand, but I do think it needs to be discussed, because I think too frequently people, the public, financial markets, and policymakers think that monetary and fiscal policies are levers that you can adjust to get the same economic performance. And I think that's incorrect. Monetary policy affects aggregate demand. If you try to replicate that with, as you point out, through tax and transfer policies, fiscal policy allocates national resources and affects incentives that affects the long run economic performance very differently than the monetary authority is capable of doing. And so I don't think it's sleight of hand, but I don't buy your proposition that you can easily replicate monetary policy
I did
through
say
fiscal
easily.
policy.
I said through well-chosen taxes and transfers, it's possible in principle, but the point of that was, well, for one thing, I have to say, if any of you have ever tried to look up a definition of fiscal policy, part of the problem is the definitions you find are not very clear, so I think we have different concepts in our mind of fiscal policy. So to the extent that I use fiscal policy as saying anything that by which the government affects the real allocation of resources has a fiscal element to it, makes what I say almost true by definition, but it takes a wider view of the definition of fiscal than what you probably have in mind. So I think part of the need to have more of a discussion of this on a table is just to work out the semantics, because they matter quite a bit.
I'm going to weigh in. I'm going to weigh on the familiar relationship here. They're not twins. Monetary and fiscal policy are not twins. Maybe first cousins. Close, becoming more related, particularly at the zero bound. That's what a lot of economists spend a lot of time talking about. Is there a question over here?
Can I respond?
Please, yeah, Charlie, and then we'll
Okay.
go over here.
So I just want to clarify, and first apologize to Debbie for interrupting her before, because I get emotional about process issues. So I
Mansplaining, Charlie.
what's that?
Mansplaining, it's called.
Okay. I learn new words all the time. Yeah, I think it was just rejected, but anyway.
Please, Charlie.
So the thing that I think is really important these days, as we're all debating the administrative state, and I run a program that at the Hoover Institution that looks at the administrative state over the past 4 decades especially. And what's been coming out of that discussion, and that's why I'm so hot about it, is how much we do care about process per se. That is, I think economists tend to be reductionist in thinking that everything translates to allocations of resources. I don't believe that's true. I don't think people care just about allocations of resources. They also care about process per se as a final good. And that's the thing. We're very upset in our society, many of us, that we've moved away from formal rulemaking toward guidance. It's a similar kind of thing. It's about the failure of due process. We're upset about things happening behind closed doors because it's not a legitimate policy as part of our democracy. And the history of the creation of central banks, and I want to reiterate this and emphasize it, and the debates about them were largely debates, going back to the very beginning, they were debates about legitimacy of the process of the action, not just the outcome. And I think that's appropriate. That's what we should be talking about, not just, so I agree with Debbie, maybe more than Mickey does, that I agree with her that in principle, although it's not easy, that you can replicate of the redistributive consequences of monetary policy with some kind of fiscal policy, but only through a very different process. And the reason that we have restricted appropriately central banks to certain processes is that that is a delegation that is legitimate. Whereas if we try to give them other processes that wouldn't be a legitimate delegation, not based on economic outcomes, but based on process concerns. And one of the reasons where so many of us are so upset about the movement away from formal rulemaking toward guidance in the administrative state, not just the Fed, but the Fed is part of it, is that we really believe that we're diminishing, distorting our democracy in ways that cause direct loss to us even before we think about the economic outcome. And I feel pretty strongly about it.
All right, please, yes.
Anne Marie Mulenda. As I listen to this and realize I'm leaning much closer to what Charles is saying than what Deborah is saying, I found myself saying, well, there's one sort of basic principle that I'm sure we're all very aware of but hasn't been stated, is that money and the value of money in this country and in most of the world is fiat determination, which means it costs essentially nothing to produce it. And it is because of that, and not all of these other things so much, that makes monetary policy separate from everything else. And I think that the profession grappled with this for a long time, versus quantity money versus fiat money, and then they gave up on quantity money because it was too easy to cheat, and so forth. And then we come back to, well, fiat money uncontrolled is inflationary, and we all believe inflation is bad. But then I step back and somebody said something about professional and public agreement being necessary for an independent agency. And about inflation, there really isn't. So I throw that out for comment and discussion.
You want to go first?
Yeah,
Please,
may
Debbie.
I mean, something I didn't get to say that I'll throw out is also controversial is, I think what's interesting about a focus on distribution, if you will, is that, of course, monetary policy, the carve-out that it has is to deal with things like the price level, and that is where it has wide support. Its other goals are more controversial. But in any case, there's different ways that central banks go about trying to influence the price level. So, in fact, although they do have control of the money supply, you never hear anyone talking about monetary aggregates or the fiat money, which is the thing they can do for free. In fact, Feds have gone to policies that are mostly focused on moving interest rates. And so they're looking for an indirect mechanism by which, say, if you lower the interest rate, you increase borrowing, which increases aggregate demand, which pushes up prices. So that's a very indirect way of affecting the price level. Another way to affect the price level would be to have a helicopter drop of fiat money on everyone, and then everyone would have more money in their pockets. They'd try to spend more, and that's kind of actually how I learned monetary policy. When I was a graduate student, was more of but what was interesting to me in thinking about the distributional aspects is I would argue that what we now consider normal monetary policy is this weird indirect mechanism of messing with interest rates in order to stimulate aggregate demand is in fact much more redistributional than were you to be able to drop helicopter money on everyone proportional to the income that they already have. Because in that case, you wouldn't be just helping savers at the expense of borrowers and so forth, but you would really be doing things evenly. So I do think that
That's a really interesting
I
point.
haven't heard, I don't know if anyone has thought
No.
about that before, so I just wanted to throw it in the mix. But the point is that we haven't moved away from the importance of the ability to create fiat money, but I think it's kind of orthogonal to the kind of issues that I'm concerned with.
Well, so I really like your point, but I want to disagree that it's orthogonal because, in fact, I think that the three of us, Anne Marie, you and I, agree about one thing that came out in your presentation and mine and in her statement, if I understood the point of this. So the fact that money can be created without cost means that it can be created very suddenly. That's what I think the point is of your statement. And the reason why monetary policy, defined as the ability of an agency to very suddenly produce a large amount of change in money without the political checks and balances. The reason that that is so is because it can be done at zero cost. It's especially dangerous. And this came out in your presentation and mine because you admitted, if I heard you right, that monetary policy does have this particular fact that makes it a little different from all the other government activities, and that is it's especially tempting from the standpoint of myopia to goose the machine quickly because you get a big payoff. So reputational equilibria, which we can rely on for a lot of things in government, don't work if the short-term gain is very large compared to the long-term gain. And so that's where the myopia risk becomes very large, precisely because the cost of doing it is so small. And then furthermore, which you also recognize, and the cost of correcting it to get back to the right long term is very painful. So I think the real, and your statements recognize this, the real argument for the exceptionalism of monetary policy from the standpoint of delegation does very much revolve around the myopia and the cost of reestablishing reputation, which is closely related to the fact that you can so costlessly, physically costlessly, goose it.
Can I just say one more thing about it being
Absolutely.
free, and then I'll try to make it brief. I don't think it is free. I mean, it's physically free to print the money, but there's nothing free about the government spending it one way or
Absolutely.
another. So when the government inflates and effectively takes that money and uses it to buy goods and services, again, that's equivalent to a tax. It is not free. So mechanically free, functionally not at all free. I mean, it contradicts, you know, the fact that there's distributional consequences to say that it's free. It takes from some and gives to others.
Absolutely. But it may still matter.
But I mean, it doesn't matter that there's an element of free.
No,
There's
no,
a large element
I
of
think
not free.
that's where Anne Marie and I agree, that it does matter because it makes it physically easier for it to happen.
Well,
Just
that's
physically.
right.
Imagine
It does
if
make it easier to have.
right.
No, I just mean that it doesn't mean that
Yes, you're
it's
right.
not truly free. So the word free
course not.
usually connotes it doesn't expend resources, but I think that's not
We
true.
agree.
All right, we're going to take one more, been very patient, and then that's it. Well, we have to keep it quick. Keep it quick.
I guess mostly for Charlie, to what extent has the Fed and the United States given up its monetary independence to the Basel Accords in terms of liquidity ratios and so forth?
Well, it's regulatory independence to some extent. And it did that, again, as Debbie's pointing out too, in a very hidden way. That is, we never had a debate in Congress about whether to adopt the Basel standards, and we delegated huge regulatory autonomy to the Fed. And the Fed has decided, as part of its playing nice with other international regulators, to simply give them, to share power with them over some elements of U.S. regulation. I don't know whether people in the United States are even aware that the delegation to the Fed was then further delegated through power sharing with the Basel Committee. It's yet another reason why we don't want that power, that clearly fiscal power of regulation, to be in the Fed.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks so much.